now we want to talk about, like, Judah, it's the speculation of the future. Jim Brown's story has been written and told. He has passed away this past week, last Friday, at the age of 87. And, man, the life and times of Jim Brown can take us into many, many different ways of conversation. As we welcome to the program Dave Zirin. He was the author of Jim Brown, Last Man Standing, and he hosts a radio show with our guy, Ton Thomas. So a pleasure to welcome you in here today, Dave. Thanks so much for the time.
Oh, it's great to be here, especially because I know all too well that while Jim Brown may have been born in St. Simon Island, Georgia, his legend truly came of age in Syracuse, New York.
Yeah, it started down there, ended up on Long Island, then up here to Syracuse. And Dave, you wrote the most recent comprehensive book on Jim's life. And what was he, about 80 or so when you were writing that book? What in that time of his life when you were, digging into it was the reflections on his time at Syracuse?
Well, it was interesting because, first of all, the memories that he held of Syracuse were extremely vivid. And there's a bit of a complicated Syracuse story that Jim Brown reflected upon a great deal. You see, Jim Brown was an incredible 15 yards a carry running back in high school in Great Neck, Long Island. And he was offered scholarships to play football across the country, even in those segregated times where many of the best teams were all white. And he wanted to go to Syracuse because his mentor, a judge named Ed Malloy, went to Syracuse. And so Jim Brown says, that's where I want to go. But the coach at Syracuse, a legend named Ben Schwartzwalder, did not want a second black athlete on the football team. He had one who was kicked off the team named Evadus Stone, and he said that was not going to happen again. So Judge Malloy, was able to get Jim Brown to get on the team, but without a scholarship. That was the compromise they came up with. But Jim Brown did not know that when he arrived at the Syracuse campus for the first time. It was something he learned, and he actually had to earn a scholarship as a football player on the Syracuse team. And he was getting so few carries his sophomore year that he was told by one coach to learn how to punt.
Crazy, like Jim Brown. Tell that of all the things, like telling Jim Brown he's not good enough at the sport seems the crazy part of it. What was the sense of, you said Jim had the vivid memories, and obviously there's the good and bad. Obviously there's racism tied to it, going back to the mid '50s. There's the lacrosse stories he's spoken glowingly of his time on the Syracuse lacrosse team for Roy Simmons Sr. When Jim looked back on it, what do you think stuck with him most over the years from Syracuse?
Honestly, it was in fact lacrosse and playing on the indigenous reservations nearby as well, and the connections with the Native American community around Syracuse and the playing of lacrosse at Syracuse. I mean, Jim Brown, if you asked him, would have said lacrosse was his favorite sport, period. And to be able to have him as part of that unbelievable Syracuse lacrosse tradition, to me, is such a gift. I mean, the athletes that you've had come through that school on the lacrosse field are just unreal, which makes it all the more incredible that his coach, Roy Simmons Sr., when he was inducted into the Lacrosse Hall of Fame, said that Jim Brown was, in fact, the best lacrosse player that he had ever seen. So the lacrosse was the friendships for Jim Brown were very real. Because we have to remember, you're right to talk about the racism. You're right to talk about the quota system on the football team. But at the same time, you had this young generation of students that just loved the guy. And they called him Touchdown Jimmy Brown. And when Coach Schwartzwalder wouldn't play Jim Brown, it was the students chanting, "We want Brown." When they were telling him to be a punter, the students saw him as a hero. So that gap was something that stayed with Jim Brown, that, maybe a lot of the institution was way tougher on him than they ever should have been. But the colleagues, the students, the friendships, and the sport of lacrosse, I mean, that was really in his heart.
Yeah, and there's a and Dave Zirin is our guest. He was the author of Jim Brown, Last Man Standing. There's a very direct line, obviously, between Jim Brown to Ernie Davis, to the first African-American to win the Heisman Trophy. Is that something that Jim took pride in later in life, that, he didn't win it, but there's a very direct tie between him and the guy that did?
Yes, I mean, the Heisman race that Jim Brown lost his senior year was very embittering. I believe he came in eighth that year.
Fifth was the final number,
Fifth? Yes, I'm sorry, fifth. Paul Hornig won it with far inferior statistics. Actually, everybody in front of Jim Brown had inferior statistics. Dick Schaff, the great sports writer who played against Jim Brown in lacrosse, actually was a voter at that time. He never voted for the Heisman Trophy again after that because of Jim Brown not winning. But I'll tell you this, like I was in Jim Brown's house, and the only framed photo of him as a football player was a painting of him in the Syracuse orange, number 44. So, it was real.
That's his time at Syracuse, and obviously that's, directly our tie here with the Jim. And, he came back every now and again. I'd say, I'm sure you found this too, Dave, writing the book on him. The guy had a presence about him, right? Like when you're in the room with Jim Brown, like you don't need words to be said to be aware, right, that you are in the room with Jim Brown.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, and that's, for better or worse in life, when you have that kind of force when you walk into a room, it gives off an air of, okay, I'm not going to mess with that guy. And then it's almost like you feel that first, and then it's, oh yeah, it's Jim Brown, and I'm still not going to mess with that guy. And so it's just like this force that he brings into a particular situation. I mean, this might sound a bizarre cutaway from what we're talking about, but watching the TV show Succession on Sunday, they were talking about the late character as having this kind of life force when he entered a room that could at times feel warm and that could at times feel very bullying. And I was brought from that character, Logan Roy, to Jim Brown in my mind immediately, thinking about what it was like to have those interactions. I
didn't think we were getting a Succession Jim Brown tie today. You never know what you're going to get here. And the Jim thing, and it stands out because he had the football career, the sporting career. He cut it short earlier than obviously he could have, and then went on and did so many things, which we can get into, both in civil rights, both in gang violence, and then there's always with Jim, and this is the unfortunate part of the conversation. There's always the but. Because we arrive at the domestic violence stuff that was a significant part of his life as well. How do you square it all? I guess when you think about the legacy of Jim Brown.
I have to tell you, I think it takes folks with a much higher level of acumen than me to understand it, because it's not just about Jim Brown. It's frankly a question for the whole 20th century about how do we understand the art, ideas, and politics from people who are publicly admirable but who privately do things that we would find abhorrent. How do we wrestle with that as a society? And I think we're still trying to figure that out. And I think a lot of us, even those of us who think we are not, are hypocrites when it comes to this question, because art and sports, I mean, this is what life is all about. And if we chose to reject everybody who was also a part of their life was something we would find detestable, we wouldn't be left with much else. So what I've been saying to folks, and I really do believe this, is that Jim Brown is not someone we should dismiss out of hand, and is not someone we should genuflect in front of. He is somebody that we should study, because it is a life that contains a lot of lessons and a lot of pitfalls that I think we do want future generations to avoid.
Yeah, because, you look at, obviously, the bad part of it is obvious, but I feel the good part of it, do you feel the stories maybe get told less, Dave, that, the good part of Jim Brown because of the bad part of Jim Brown?
Most definitely, and those are inextricably connected, because Jim Brown, really, because of some of his personal issues, failings, violence against women, that actually held him back from the true force of his personality and his intellect and his ability to organize people from having the maximum possible impact it could have had. I mean, when we speak about people like Muhammad Ali and Bill Russell, they looked to Jim Brown, and yet as the decades went on, they were definitely held in a very different kind of esteem than Jim Brown. And so that's what makes it a tragedy, and that's why, in a lot of ways, Jim Brown fought a war within himself. That war between the best and worst parts of our instincts, and for him, it really did hold him back from a very different kind of perch he could have held in the culture. Yeah,
you look back at the famed Cleveland Summit. We talked about it the other day on the show in 1967. It involved, coming about because of Muhammad Ali's refusal to go to Vietnam. Like, that was Jim that organized all that, right, Dave? People think back, oh, that's Muhammad. No, that was Jim Brown that set all that up.
Yeah, that was 1,000% Jim Brown. And it's a great story, too. And to me, it speaks to a lot of different parts of Jim's political character. I mean, Jim Brown and a lot of these men, football players, had a piece of Muhammad Ali's contract. And with Main Event Boxing, and they weren't making any money on this contract because Ali had his title stripped because of his refusal to enter the draft for Vietnam. And so Jim Brown said, we need to support Muhammad Ali. But when he called up everybody to meet, and they all went because of Jim, just pure respect for Jim. Okay, Jim, we're coming. But a lot of them were mad at Muhammad Ali and were like, I'm going to go there to give him a talking to and tell him to just say, all right, I'll do some USO shows. I'll wear some red, white, and blue trunks. Give me my title back and let me get back to making money. And so Jim Brown actually organized everybody in a back room to hear from Ali himself. And Ali laid out his case. And by the time he was done, they were unified and came out together. And that's the background to that famous photo of the Cleveland Summit.
Yeah. And it is, I mean, it's got all the names. And obviously, it was Lou Alcindor at the time. Kareem was there. Obviously, Bill Russell was there. Muhammad is there. Jim's there. Many other famous African-American athletes of the time are in that picture. As Dave Zirin is our guest. He's the most recent biographer of Jim Brown. So you were writing that book when Jim was, give or take, 80. What were your takeaways of the man, I guess, at that age when, the prime is past at that time, but, he was still quite with it at the age of 80?
Yeah, very with it, sharp as a tack, but also very much speaking like somebody who was close to 80 and who'd lived a lot of lives and who had given and received his share of pain. So very philosophical, very talking about how he saw himself and his past in the world, talking about what he thought he did that would or would not be remembered. So a lot of big picture stuff. And also the things that he was willing to talk about, like Syracuse being one example of that, like the things that brought him joy, like Roy Simmons and lacrosse, like that. Smile to his face even, and if you can even imagine such a thing on Jim Brown, but a smile to his face and speaking about those days. But when you did stray on the stuff that gives anybody pause in his life, those moments that we're talking about, where he would erupt and where there would be pain as a result, I mean, that was nowhere he wanted to go at all. And it was difficult to even get within 1,000 degrees of those kinds of conversations. So I saw someone who is very at peace with himself, but also was not going to brook anybody who was going to try to make him feel like anything less than at peace.
Great to talk to you today, Dave. And before we let you go, is there anything else about Jim, about his life and times after passing away this last Friday at 87 that you think we should know about the guy that maybe is a sneaky behind the scenes things that hasn't been out as publicly as the rest of this stuff?
He had two of the most beautiful pit bulls I've ever seen in my entire life, and I always thought that was really interesting because you think of a pit bull as a very aggressive dog, is a dog you got to be scared of. These were teddy bears masquerading as pit bulls, and I thought that was very interesting. Man,
I mean, you talk about it. It's the good, it's the bad. It is everything. When you talk about the life and times of Jim Brown, Dave, it's been fascinating to talk with you today. Thanks so much for the time, and hopefully we'll do it again soon when something else comes up. But thanks for hopping on today.
No, thank you so much.
That is Dave Zirin, and go check it out. He wrote the book on Jim Brown. Jim Brown, Last Man Standing. You can get it, whenever books are sold, as they say. If it's on Amazon and all sorts of places like that. But thanks so much for Dave hopping on today. He also does a weekly radio show with our guy Ton Thomas. So check that out as well as many other things that Dave does. He is out there and quite accomplished. But Jim Brown, we talked about it yesterday. Passed away last week. There's a lot of bad stuff, and obviously the domestic violence is the A number one of that list. But a fascinating life that is kind of impossible to square the good and the bad, no matter which way you look at it. But ties back to Syracuse, and in many, many ways, it all started here. Those many, many years ago, going back now more than 60 years, longer than that, 65, 66 years since Jim left campus here in